All right, well, welcome all. Welcome to today's webinar, which is about exploring how to facilitate engaging and productive virtual meetings. So I'm Melanie Knapp, and I'm here with my colleagues, Brian Manwaring and Stephanie Lucero. And we're excited to be spending the time with you today, exploring and discussing this topic, getting into some best practices that we found, and also pulling from you about tools that you've used and strategies you've used for virtual meetings in the setting that we're all finding ourselves in. Just a note that we are recording today's webinar. If you have any concerns or questions about that recording, feel free to let us know in the chat box. So there's a way to drop down and you can be in connection with all panelists. So let us know if you have any concerns. As we mentioned, for those of you who were on a few minutes before, all of your videos are turned off. And the only place you would show up on the recording is in the chat box if you were to make a comment, or later we may invite audio lines, people to participate over audio, so you would be on the recording if you chose to do that as well. But let us know if you have any concerns. We do plan to post the recording of this webinar, barring any unforeseen difficulties, on our website, so that would be accessible. And we do also plan to share a copy of the slides with all of you after the webinar. So we'd like to hear from you and, just invite you to chat into the box. So your name and where you're joining us from. We want to know who's in the room, who's with us on this webinar. So you might be wondering, how do I do that? And so you will see in your Zoom toolbar, there's a chat icon. So you can click on the chat. You'll get a chance to chat to all attendees and the panelists, or just the panelists. So if you can choose panelists and attendees, and I see that we've got a lot of those coming in already. So you can take a look at where we're getting folks from. So I'm seeing Seattle, Colorado, Eugene, Oregon, Portland, Troy, Montana. So we've got folks really nationally, and we'll talk a little bit about who's on the line. So this is great, seeing lots of them coming in. DC. So we've got every time zone, I think, represented across the country. So wonderful. So to give you a little more information about who's joining us, and this data is approximate because we did have some changes as we kind of got down to the wire with registrations. But this graphic, as part of our registration process, we asked you about the types of meetings you're facilitating and the organizations that you work with. So predominantly on the call, we have federal agencies, but we do have a number of folks from other sectors, so state and local agencies, academia, or private organizations, and we also have Native nations that are represented as well. The majority of you are facilitating meetings that have between 7 and 15 participants. So that's the orange bar that you see on this graphic. So the blue line is the total number of participants in that category, and the orange bar is the percentage of you that told us that 7 to 15 is the meeting size that you're facilitating most often. The second most facilitated size was 15 to 50. So there were a number of folks that are facilitating larger meetings. And then, other categories were 0 to 6 or not facilitating at all. So that gives you a sense of kind of who's with us on the call, who's with us on this webinar, who's on the line. And there were at least 3 of you joining us internationally, so that's great to see, and welcome to everyone. So just a few more tips about interacting via Zoom, and many of you I know are Zoom experts at this point. But for those of you who may have used it a little less, so there's a few features we'll use throughout the webinar. So the first is the Q&A function. So you have an icon for Q&A. Anytime in the webinar, feel free to add in questions that you may have and that you hope that we'll get to as part of the webinar. We want to hear from you with questions. There's also the ability to upvote, so you can look and see if there are questions you think are particularly important or that you'd like to raise in importance. We may have more questions come in than we have time to answer. So that will allow, the ability to prioritize questions that you'd really like to see. So that's also in the Q&A function. We've already, been using the chat. Reach out to us in chat throughout the webinar. You can chat with just the panelists, or you can chat with everyone. So responses, any technical issues, reach out to us in the chat. We will be using a few polls throughout. So we'll open up a poll, you'll see it come up on your screen. So please engage in the polls when we utilize them in the webinar. And if you don't see a poll pop up, there is an icon that you can click, and sometimes it doesn't show up automatically on your screen. Sometimes you have to click into that icon. So we'll use a few polls. And at a couple select times, we'll ask if there's any audio input. So anyone that wants to contribute to the conversation verbally. So if you do want to get in the queue to share verbally, then raising your hand would be the best way to let us know that you'd like to do that.
And just a quick note, I noticed some of you did raise your hand in the chat function. We will be monitoring that when we open up the audio, but if you have specific questions and not just sharing over chat, you can also use the Q&A, and I noticed some of you answered in the Q&A versus the chat. Both are fine. And if you have questions on the differences, we can get into that later in the webinar.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to our director, Brian Manwaring.
All right, thanks, Melanie, and good morning or good afternoon for everybody out there. I just want to welcome, my name is Brian Manwaring, I'm the director of the National Center for Environmental Conflict Resolution. And I just wanted to take a couple minutes to welcome you to the webinar, introduce the center a little bit, and then I'll hand it back to Melanie and Stephanie. I know virtual engagement, virtual meetings, virtual facilitation are all on the top of folks' minds today for good reason. So glad everybody could join us. So a little bit about the National Center and who we are. I see several names that I recognize, but some that I don't, and I'm sure we're new to some folks on the line with us today. But so just to set this up a little bit, we are a federal program. We're one of several programs in the Udall Foundation. So the Udall Foundation is a small, independent executive branch agency, and we're headquartered in Tucson, Arizona, but we have an office in DC and folks around the country working remotely. So when Congress established us back in 1998, they mandated us to provide a range of services to enhance collaboration and conflict resolution on environmental, public lands, and natural resources issues. We do that through a number of different ways and really through three categories of work and service that we provide. So one is project work. So we're our staff, Melanie, Stephanie, and the other staff members. We have our mediators and facilitators. We do mediation, facilitation, assessment, and those kinds of things. We also work quite a bit with the private sector to provide those services. We also work to build collaborative capacity in the federal government. And we do that through our training program, which Melanie runs, plus webinars like these. And then lastly, we work to develop, enhance, and enable the use of environmental collaboration and conflict resolution tools throughout the federal government to support good governance. So with respect to this webinar, virtual or remote convening and facilitation has been a part of our work for a number of years. However, as we've all seen with COVID-19, the importance of these tools, the importance of the approaches for virtual engagement has accelerated. And, we use these now to communicate and coordinate internally with our work teams, with our partners, and with our stakeholders. So in our work in the world of environmental collaboration and conflict resolution, we tend to value those face-to-face interactions with our colleagues and our partners. That face-to-face interaction allows us to connect on a personal level, it helps build relationships, it enhances communication, both verbally and non-verbally. And for those reasons, we tend to advocate for in-person engagements in our work. So it's almost a default setting for us. But with COVID-19, that's turned all of that thinking on its head. And we now engage virtually for our daily tasks, for big collaborative experts, and so forth. So, and I think, at least from my perspective, it's been amazing to see how quickly the federal government, organizations, state and local government, and others have adapted to these new circumstances. In many instances, what we found in our couple months now that we've been operating mostly in a virtual environment, but we found that virtual collaboration has exceeded expectations in many aspects of our work. So it allows us to connect in a different way, maybe not the same and in many ways, maybe not the same beneficial ways that in-person engagement gives us, but it does allow us to connect in a different way. And maybe our personal stories are more accessible because we've invited people into our homes. One example, with the Udall Foundation, we're a small agency, we're about 26 staff. I've been here for 12 years. And we had our first all virtual all hands staff meeting. So if you can imagine 26 Brady Bunch squares stacked up. And we did our business, and right as we were signing off, somebody grabbed their pet and pulled them up to the camera. And that sparked probably 15 to 20 other people who just happened to have their pets nearby, grab their pets. And it was an uplifting moment in really uncertain times and really a bonding moment for our staff. So we've seen some good things, but there are inherent challenges with engaging virtually. That's what we're here for. We're also seeing some long-term impacts now. So we're seeing that there's maybe some burnout because we're all engaged virtually now all the time. So not only are our meetings virtual, our work is virtual. So we're sitting in front of a computer during our 8 hours a day or whatever we work. But then I think for many of us, our happy hours are virtual, our book clubs are virtual, maybe our family meetings are virtual. And so we are maybe seeing some exhaustion with it. And maybe because of that, our attention spans are starting to lessen. It reminds me of a quote that I just saw. Somebody had mentioned that they're tired of watching TV shows with the actors always making eye contact. And so this is almost in a way become our TV and our entertainment. So anyways, with running virtual meetings, it's important for us to create those conditions to help participants focus. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Melanie and Stephanie, who are going to go over some of these lessons that we've learned. And I will turn my video off and I'll observe just like you.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, just to give you a sense of the agenda for the webinar today, and I'm trying to click the slide here. Okay, here we go. So, in this webinar, we're really going to focus on improving the effectiveness of meetings that require active participation and interactions. So, whether it's making decisions, solving problems, or strengthening relationships. So really focus on meetings with a collaboration or a decision-making or relationship-building aspect. All of these are active processes, and they won't be successful if participants are disengaged or absent. So we with that framing, we have a few topics in mind for the webinar today. So the first is just fundamentally, when do we think about doing virtual meetings? What are some of those criteria that need to be met? What are some of the considerations that go into making that decision? What are some challenges and tips with achieving great engagement in a virtual setting? We've talked about already, and I think we all know from all of our experiences in this time and outside of this, that virtual meetings are different. There are different challenges, and so there are different strategies that are useful in a virtual setting. Then we'll talk about 8 principles for facilitating engaging virtual meetings, and we'll also give tips and tools throughout those principles. And then we'll have some time for discussion and wrap up and questions, and we'll hear from you all as part of that, and I want to bring you all in. So that's what's on the agenda for today. And as part of the registration process, we also asked you what you hope to get out of the training. And we heard, really 3 main areas. So virtual engagement tools, wanting to know different tools for engaging on a virtual platform. What does facilitation look like on a virtual platform? Are there any kind of considerations or differences that you think about in a virtual setting? And then different aspects around engaging, having an engaging and meaningful discussion virtually. So a few things that we will share about on today's webinar, matching the goals of the meeting with the type of the meeting that you're having. What are your goals and what kind of meeting might come out of that? Different considerations for addressing meeting fatigue and managing energy levels in a virtual setting, which is different than an in-person setting. We'll talk about, utilizing certain tools for engagement, factors to limit contentious meetings, and then some communication tips. There are some things that we did hear interest from that we won't be covering. And so, those are how to use specific platforms or specific functionalities. So things like how to set up a breakout room or how to address connectivity issues. Those are all critical in a virtual facilitation setting. We won't be covering those. We'll be kind of speaking from a broader sense about engaging meetings and facilitation across all platforms. So we won't get into the specifics of those. We won't be addressing large meetings or public engagement meetings that are focused primarily on public engagement, NEPA public meetings, although some of what we discuss may be relevant also in those settings. It won't be what our primary focus of this webinar is. And we also won't be covering in detail, the considerations of converting in-person meetings to virtual meetings. So there are a number of, thinking about what's the structure of my engagement and how do I take what was an in-person meeting and transition it into a virtual setting. So we'll get into that a bit, but we won't be covering that in depth. And so if you have anything else to add, anything else you hope to gain from the webinar today, feel free to add it in the chat anytime or ask a question. We want to hear from you throughout. So we'd like to transition to our first poll, and we want to hear from you about which platforms you are using. So we're going to go ahead and launch a poll. So we asked you also to be prepared to share, which virtual platforms you use in the course of your work. So we will go ahead and share that poll, and it'll be up for about 30 seconds. So you'll see a poll. If you don't see the poll, then go ahead and click the poll icon, and we'll see, I see we've got a number of votes coming in, so we'll have it up for just about 30 seconds. And we'll get your responses here. It looks like we've got a lot of Teams users, a lot of Zoom meeting and webinar users, WebEx, and Adobe Connect are the highest for at this point. Okay, so we'll have this just open for just a few minutes. You can see the blue bar across your screen is slowly traveling to the end. So once we get to the end, we'll go ahead and close the poll and we'll share the results with you. But we've still got a couple votes coming in.
And while we're doing that, we had a couple chats of folks that are dealing with issues of connectivity due to their platform situation, which we will address. And our behind the scenes tech wizard will be answering those questions. So just hold tight for that.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and end the poll and I'll share the results with you. So it looks like, 67% of you use Microsoft Teams regularly. So a big percentage. A lot of Zoom usage, a lot of WebEx, and a lot of Adobe Connect, and then there's some others, and I'm wondering if we had anyone share those in the chat box. Skype, looks like Skype, Google Meetings gets a lot of use.
Slack.
We've also got Ring Central.
Live stream.
Lots of different platforms. Okay, so it's great to know what you are using and different considerations for how you might think about these different meetings across those different platforms. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Stephanie.
Thanks, Melanie. And I know we got some question and answers. I'm going to be dealing with a couple of those questions as we go through this next section. I know many of you were really interested in hearing some tips on how to manage virtual meetings and thinking through platforms. We'll be answering some of those questions in this next section, and then we've got a whole section on tips. But before we got into that, we really wanted to focus on some of the fundamentals of meeting planning. And when we're talking about that, we're really talking about what are the basic facilitation steps that you do in any meeting design, whether it be in person or virtual. And so really thinking through what is the purpose of the meeting? What are the outcomes, the intent, why we need to have a meeting? Why is the meeting important? And then from there, identifying whether a virtual meeting is going to meet those outcomes and desired expectations for the meeting. And then once we identify that a virtual meeting can meet our objectives, really thinking through the criteria for choosing the virtual meeting platform, the types of tools, the types of exercises or design that you might incorporate into that meeting. So that's going to be our next section. So think about what you answered in terms of the types of meeting platforms you're using. And then from there, we can discuss whether they work for the meeting you're planning to design. So this should be fairly recognizable to many of you. It's a collaborative spectrum. It's a variation that we've seen. And there's many out there, but this one is really to get through the question of what's the purpose of the meeting. And we're going to start from the bottom up, but thinking through what types of meetings you're trying to do, what are you trying to achieve, what is the value, the meaningfulness of the meeting that you're going to put together. You know, we ask ourselves, hopefully, anytime we plan a meeting, do I need this meeting? What good will this meeting provide? What impact will it have? And thinking through that, the purpose is going to be an important criteria for that. So we're pretty familiar with information sharing meetings. And I know many of you are interested in hearing about information meetings. And just FYI, we will provide some tools and tips that you can use for large public engagement and information sharing, but a lot of what we're going to be discussing is not going to be in that criteria. And those types of meetings, if you're thinking about it, are really meetings where the information is going one way. You're sharing information, you're answering questions, you're helping to increase understanding. And the reason that they're that way is because you're dealing usually with a large geographic scope. You're trying to touch a lot of different folks and share information across a large geographic area. You're dealing with a number of participants, probably like 50 plus to 100, 300, over 200 like we are today. And so those are usually the qualities that you see in an information sharing or public engagement. And some of the tools you might use for that is obviously large in-person meetings, virtual webinars where, like we're doing today, you can get some information in a virtual platform. You might also consider social media, print media, radio. Those are the types of tools you usually see in information sharing types of meetings where the purpose is to share that information one way out. Next, we might look at conferring meetings, and that you might get a little bit more input. There's a little bit more of hearing perspectives. It's similar to workshops or trainings where there is a lot of information out, but there's also an opportunity to engage and hear from their participants. And so that's kind of another area of a purpose. What we're going to be focusing on predominantly today, both in terms of our tips and our discussion, is this higher category that we have at the top, which is the collaborate and discuss. Those types of meetings where you're really looking to engage your audience. You're going to be working on developing documents together, maybe action plans. Really, the qualifications of these types of collaborate and discuss meetings are meetings where the intent is to have a back and forth conversation, a dialogue. You're going to be developing creative solutions together. And some of the other qualifications for these types of meetings is you're dealing with a smaller number of participants. And I know we got a question about, you know, what's the largest meeting that's manageable? And really in defining what a manageable meeting is really defining what the purpose is. And so when we're looking at collaborate and discuss meetings, we're really looking at a smaller group of people, because that's going to be the most manageable for back and forth discussions. It's also going to be a lot more manageable for dealing with contention that we might encounter depending on where folks are in terms of seeing eye to eye and sharing their perspectives. So the number of people in the meeting may also be a factor of what type of outcomes you can expect, particularly in a virtual platform. And we'll discuss that a little bit more detail. So we're going to be looking at the collaborate and discuss types of meetings. And once we decide, okay, our purpose of the meeting is to collaborate and discuss, we have to ask ourselves, will a virtual platform be appropriate? And as Brian alluded to, our backup is usually in person. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lot of opportunities associated with in-person meetings in terms of relationship building, connection that we can achieve, whether it be in the room or kind of outside of the room in the halls. And so when we look at taking those kind of collaborative discussion type meetings and converting them into a virtual platform, or thinking through whether a virtual platform is going to work for us, we really need to think through, will we be able to achieve the meeting purpose? If the meeting purpose is to build relationships, that might be a little bit harder. If the meeting purpose is to develop a document together, that might work. And then also the first question that we have on this checklist is, can we achieve those purposes through other means? Can we send an email or initiate a phone call with more one-on-one interaction? Is the group small enough to do that? Is it a situation where we can use social media, or can we do a pre-recorded webinar and then get some input that way? Will that achieve the purpose we need in a meaningful way? And then, you know, in thinking through that, if the answer is no, or the answer is we're not sure, another question is, do the project timelines require that we have this discussion now? Can we wait until an in-person is feasible? And I know for many of you that's not going to be the case. You have project timelines you're dealing with that you can't wait because we don't know. There's so many unknowns in terms of when it'll be appropriate for in-person. There might be situations where it just doesn't make sense geographically, space-wise, time-wise. And so you might not have that flexibility in timeline. But making sure that's part of the equation in your criteria for deciding on a virtual meeting is really important. And we'll discuss in a little bit more detail why. But think through, can we make this an in-person meeting if in-person is going to meet the purposes the best? And then do we have that flexibility? And then really what's the most important in determining whether a virtual meeting is appropriate is, will the necessary participants be able to engage virtually? And we've seen some of that. We've had some comments and questions even on ours. We knew that a Zoom meeting might be difficult for some federal agencies. That situation is going to be the same across the board. Some federal agencies can't use certain platforms. Some groups might not be able to use certain platforms. There's a whole host of reasons why folks may not be able to participate in a particular virtual meeting. It could be licenses for the meeting. It might be familiarity with the platform. It could also be a situation of accessibility. We know internet functionality and accessibility is very limited in certain parts of the country and for certain communities. And knowing that and being aware on whether or not that is going to be an important factor, and specifically if the people that we're trying to reach, the people that we want to engage and collaborate with, can't participate in the virtual platform that we've decided, we have to think through how we design that meeting, or whether or not that meeting is going to be meaningful and fit the purposes that we're looking at. So those are really kind of the items to think through on whether or not a virtual meeting is appropriate and how we craft that meeting. All of those criteria and factors really get to, are we meeting the principles of environmental conflict and collaborative resolution? And hopefully these are familiar to you. If they're not, please visit our website. The link's at the bottom. It's at udall.gov. And all of these are really important when we're looking at any type of meeting design and discussion, but they're going to be particularly important when we're looking at virtual meetings. And the ones I really want to bring your attention to is balanced voluntary representation. Are the diverse perspectives that we want to include in our dialogue going to be able to engage? Can all the people we want as part of our discussion going to be part of the discussion? Linked to that is, will there be an informed process? Do the people have the materials and the functionality to participate in the way that we designed the meeting? So for example, if you design a meeting that requires breakout sessions in your webinar, or chat or question and answer like we're doing here today, if folks can't participate in that webinar function, will that limit the functionality and achieving the purpose of your meeting? So thinking through that in how you design the meeting and how you design the way that you're going to engage with your audience is really important. And ensuring that the participants that you want to collaborate with have an opportunity to engage in the methods that you've designed, and also that there's many alternatives to meet their own comfort level. And that gets to the third of these that is really important in virtual meetings, and that's openness. Are we designing a meeting and having a meeting that allows for openness? In this environment that we're in, most people don't necessarily feel that engaging in a virtual meeting can be voluntary, right? It's the only way we can meet in many ways. And so that's gonna change the openness that people have. And I think it's going to be part of what a lot of us are already seeing in terms of willingness to engage in a video. You know, there's people who might be taking the option not to put their video screen on, and that might be an important part of your meeting design. So thinking through what alternatives you can use and what variety of engagement tools you might want to incorporate is going to be important to ensuring that your audience, your participants feel comfortable and they have plenty of options on how they engage. And because that openness is going to help with their engagement. And we're going to be discussing some of those in more detail, but these are all factors that we want to think through as we develop the meeting. And then just be be thoughtful of how each of these different factors play into your decision to do a virtual meeting and how you design that meeting. So we did have some questions and answers, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to come back to some of those questions. We answered some of them in live, and I see a few right now. We have some questions about transforming in-person meetings into a virtual platform, and we will be discussing in terms of time frames. I will point out, and actually before I get to that, I noticed that that one is at the top because some of you use that upvote. And so upvote is another really great tool for the question and answer tool, where folks can ask a question and others can see what questions have been asked and kind of do a thumbs up. I think it's this way on the screen. And then we can see how much interest there is in that question. And so that's another great way to help folks and an alternative way for folks to engage. So with this upvote, we see that folks are interested in how to convert in-person into virtual platforms. I think an important aspect of that, we're working on that ourselves, and an important quality of that is thinking through what the objective of the section is, and not necessarily relying on the fact that any in-person meeting can be transformed into a virtual platform. There's pros and cons to both in-person and virtual, and really thinking through what those are to meet your objectives is the most important aspect. There's other factors that Melanie is going to deal with very shortly in some of the tips, and those are really about level of interest, engagement, the timing of the sequences. You're not going to be able to do 8 hours on a virtual platform and that you would do 8 hours in person. It's just a different dynamic. So thinking through that, we'll get through some of those. In terms of ADA access, Melanie is going to deal with that, so I'm going to hold that question that we have. I know there's a lot of interest in that. That's a really important aspect of meeting your participants and being cognizant of whether or not your platform can do that. And we're not going to get into the details of which platforms do what, but some webinar tools do offer some functionality for transcription. Sign language is something you can do, but it's another factor that you need to do. There's a lot that goes into it. So we have a couple of those questions. We're going to get to more of them, and I know my team has been answering some of those questions, so that's great. I'll check and make sure if there's any more. So we're going to do a quick activity here, and this is going to be testing your knowledge. So we're going to do another poll, and if folks can tell us what types of meetings they've actually been facilitating, whether they're collaborative, decision-making, information sharing, etc. So we're going to do this one again really quickly, see if you took in some of the information we shared, and we can go from there. And it looks like those answers are coming in quickly, so thank you all. All right, our time is almost up. You'll see that bar is almost to the end. Get those answers in. All right, so we're going to end the poll now. And it looks like a good chunk of you are doing the collaborative and decision-making type meetings, so that's great. Glad to know that this is meeting your needs. For those of you that there is a good chunk of you that are also doing information sharing, and I would say, as you can see, 75%, most of you are doing information sharing. So as we go through some of these tips and kind of addressing the challenges, think through whether or not you can achieve some of those information sharing methods in a different format, or utilizing webinar in a way that addresses some of the challenges that we're seeing from our participants in terms of their personal resources and capacity and timing. Like maybe you do a pre-recorded webinar so folks can watch it at their leisure, or you focus more on more information sharing or pre-designed questions in advance. So think through creatively how you can do that because that is a really important aspect of what we're doing. And I also see we've got a lot of internal operational and work planning meetings. Really good jump. Really happy to see that nobody said, I'm not sure, there's no difference. So either you know about what we're talking about or you were paying really close attention. And then I'm just checking, Melanie, did we get any in the chat box that were not in there?
We did. So training, course delivery, Section 106 stakeholder meetings, NEPA meetings, public comment meetings, and mediation were some of the public scoping meetings. So a number of other different types of meetings.
And I did know there was a fun question that I will answer because it's in my term. We did confer instead of consult, and that's because particularly for me, who works a lot with Native nations, consult can have very specific connotations, and we didn't have time to get into the difference between Merriam Dictionary consults versus government-to-government consultation, because those are very different, potentially, types of meetings. So for those of you that asked that and who noticed there's the difference in that collaborative spectrum, that's why. Great, thanks for the answers, and we are going to be checking those throughout, but I do want to get to the next item because this will lead into the tips that Melanie is going to share with us, and that's really thinking through the challenges for achieving great engagement. Most of you, this is going to be stuff that you're really familiar with, and quite honestly, most of the challenges that we encounter on a virtual platform are very similar to the challenges that we'd encounter in person. And when we do a meeting design correctly, we really hit all these points. We welcome diversity, we enhance communication, we build relationships, we promote joint problem solving, effective implementation of the solutions that are developed jointly, continuous improvement. But where we really have the greatest challenge, and that is really exacerbated in a virtual platform, achieving all of these, is managing groups' energy. And so that's where a virtual meeting is even more challenging than the in-person meetings that we might encounter, and where we really need to think through that in our planning. So we're going to do a longer discussion of these principles, but as we go through the challenges, think through the challenges that you encounter. Our hope is that through most of these principles, we're going to have 8 very shortly, in terms of tone, relationships, accountability, energy, that through these tips, you'll be able to address those challenges. But I'm going to ask you to put your thinking caps on as we move into the next section. We're going to talk a little bit about those challenges and then think through how the tips we offer can address those. And then if we don't address them, we'll have some time to talk in more detail. So real quickly, get your chat box open. Think through the challenges that you've encountered in achieving great engagement in virtual meetings. So right now, just keep going through there. I'm monitoring it, as is my team. And we really want to see what you guys think through. And if you're having trouble thinking through what you might want to put, here's some visual cues of challenges you might encounter in a virtual meeting. And think through what these might mean to you, or, just to help stimulate some thought.
A number of them coming in over the chat. So dealing with distractions, oversharing, undersharing, loud dominances, connectivity issues, keeping participants focused, balancing interests of the folks who want to power through versus those who need a break, especially audio difficulties, partial engagement, multitasking, off-topic chatting, distraction, kiddo distractions, lack of response. So a lot of themes, pets, one person dominating, quiet, no one sharing, using mute or unmute. So what are those technical aspects that come into it? Unable to read facial expressions, body language. So the challenges of that in a virtual setting where we have these small boxes and limited nonverbal feedback. How to get folks to talk, so how to actually have those conversations. No engagement, so similar. Lack of engagement, tired of screens, awkward silences, interest versus positional engagement, so how to kind of dig into getting to the interest in a kind of virtual setting. Different comfort levels with technology and how that plays into things, capturing comments. So how do you actually, capture everything that's coming out of the discussion? Most people on video and some not. So, some people engaging in certain ways. Monitoring level of engagement. So many good, they're all still coming in, but lots of themes that you're hitting on that fall into Stephanie's challenges.
Yes. So the good news is that we're all encountering similar challenges, and yes, we are going to address those shortly. Melanie's going to get into some of the tips. I will point out I saw a lot of technical problems and how to address those. A lot of questions about kind of technical savvy of your participants. We're not doing so much of the how-to, but there are lots of really great resources on that, and we'll try to offer some tips where we can, and think through. It's just, be forewarned, we're really going to be thinking more about the participant level and not so much about the technical, but we will be addressing that to some degree. But yes, in terms of overarching challenges, when we were thinking through those visual cues, these were the types of things that we were looking at: trust, connection, communication, technical proficiency and availability. That goes in a lot into the meeting design. Multitasking and distractions, discomfort or unfamiliarity with certain tools, coordination, and virtual meeting overload, which the irony is we're talking to you in a virtual meeting about virtual meeting overload, but hopefully we'll give you some tips on how to address that. The one thing I did want to point out, and I think it's an important thing for us to remember, in addition to all of this, is the collective emergency. A lot of the tools we're going to be providing are things that you would generally do, but the COVID-19 and the experiences of our audiences, of ourselves, of our colleagues, all of those actually have an impact on meeting overload, attentiveness, willing to share, willingness even to be on video. And so thinking through that component, I think, is going to be really important as we go through the tips and items. I'll just do an example, because I noticed one of the chat was, we hear a lot of concerns with folks that, like, folks don't want to share over audio, or they prefer chat, or they won't enable their video. And while those tools are really great for us as facilitators to really understand and read social cues and to have an engaging meeting, we also have to think through that there might be limitations in terms of why people might choose or not choose to use video or chat or telephone beyond just the connectivity issues. We don't know what people are dealing with in their personal life. We don't know what bad news they might have received right before they got on the video, which may make them more hesitant to share video or to speak over the phone and prefer to chat so that they could be present in the meeting. But maybe there's some other distractions that we might need to think about. And I think it's really important as facilitators of meeting people where they are, of thinking through that as we also think through some of these overarching challenges, because it does come into play in terms of how we engage and how we have constructive discussions. So I'm going to leave you with this little bit of thinking, right? When we go into a facilitation, we're thinking everything's going great, nice slow decline hill walk, everything's great. And usually the reality is something a little bit more tumultuous. So hopefully you look at a map and you see that, oh, I might need to rappel across a cliff, or, you know, bring some more comfortable shoes, or deal with rain. But at the end of the day, no matter what your plan or your reality is, particularly when you're doing a virtual meeting, think like a facilitator. Plan ahead, look at the map, think through what the challenges you're likely going to encounter, and do your best to plan ahead and adjust for those. But also be aware that no matter what you plan for, you're going to have to be adaptive, and you're going to have to think creatively of how to deal with those things that you can't plan for, you can't control. And that is particularly prevalent in a virtual meeting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie. And for those of you that are wondering, I'll also be answering some of your questions if they're still posted.
Thanks, Stephanie. So now, you know, we'll dig into, we've been kind of alluding to these principles. So 8 different principles that we found helpful for facilitating engagement in virtual settings. So having things to do with, you know, focusing on relationships, which I saw a number of chats, you know, noting that challenge. Managing energy levels, so getting at that meeting fatigue. How do you facilitate discussion and interaction, and how do you use the time in your meetings effectively, and the time in between well? So we'll dig into a number of those and other things as we go through each principle one by one. So the first principle is setting the tone and making it personal. So, you know, it's important to begin on the right foot and set the scene for participants to have a productive meeting. So there's a lot of different techniques that you might want to use as you think about this. So, you know, one is encouraging the use of video, and, you know, I think with the nuance that Stephanie mentioned of, you know, there may be reasons people don't want to be on video at this time. So there's, you know, kind of a lot of ways to see a number of these tools and when you might use them and when you might not. So being yourself, you know, conveying warmth and presence, making eye contact throughout, which in a virtual setting is actually really difficult, you know, because then you're sort of looking at the video and you might need to be looking at the screen, but making those connections where you can. Showing up early at your meetings and being available, greeting people as they arrive. So logging in so that, you know, the 10 minutes before you're not doing other tasks, you're actually there to engage and to set that kind of level of comfort in the room. You can work with a group on developing ground rules and objectives. So doing the things to have shared objectives and shared goals, articulating those. And you know, in a virtual setting, we've talked about a little bit the delayed feedback. So you know, as a facilitator and as someone running these meetings, there is a certain level of comfort that's required with delayed feedback and technical difficulties. So like Stephanie's hills and her rappelling down the cliffs, these kind of things are going to happen. So in a virtual setting, we're not getting the nonverbal communication we're used to. There are delays based on the functionality of it, and there's research that shows that speakers actually perceive listeners as less friendly or less positive because of the built-in delay in the system that can happen virtually. And so you're dealing with these challenges where the nonverbal communication is a challenge, and the way the platforms interface with our emotional connection systems and what we expect, the kind of feedback we expect from folks. So it's going to be more challenging in a virtual setting. So even small delays can make that, you know, you might not get the kind of nods or laughs that you would get in an in-person setting. You can't kind of walk the room and get a sense, you know, there's just a lot of differences there. But how to kind of set the scene and make it personal, you might do a number of different things. And what you want to do depends entirely on the type of meeting that you're having, the goals, who's there. So what's appropriate in one setting may be something you would not want to do in another. But you know, you might want to bring in something from home, right? Where many people are still in the scenario where we're working from home. So, you know, a pet or something from their space, you know, having it, using the personal nature of being in someone's space and having them bring that in. You might tell a personal story. You can ask people, as we did in this, in the webinar, to know, you know, where you're coming from. So invite people to share where they are in the chat. You might have a themed meeting. I was actually just talking with someone about this. So, you know, and this might be more appropriate for an internal setting or group you work with all the time. But, you know, having people can change their background. They might bring something with them that matches the theme. So these different ways to kind of introduce fun and lightness into the settings where possible, and have a more personal connection. You know, at the end of a meeting, you may want to, especially if you're on a platform where you can see folks by video, you may want to unmute everyone and have them just say goodbye and wave. In a virtual, you know, in an in-person meeting, you can't imagine that everyone would just kind of fade away without saying anything to anyone. And so giving people that chance to say goodbye because you're in a different setting and acknowledge each other. And as a facilitator, and especially, you know, both Stephanie and Brian alluded to this time that we're in. So being human and modeling lightness, we're in the middle of a really challenging time, both individually and collectively. And if you can be light and kind of model the sort of tone that you're hoping for, and be human and compassionate, that's helpful to the overall any overall situation you're going to be in. So the second, and you're seeing me smile because we're having a couple PowerPoint skipping ahead challenges on my end. So the second principle is focusing on relationships, and some of you alluded to that challenge in a virtual setting of how do you relationship build when you're in a virtual setting, and that is a challenge. And we know that people perform better when they're comfortable with each other. It can lead to more candor, more mutual interests. And so, you know, and video calls can also be a challenge right now because, you know, as we've talked about, when there's a deluge of video meetings, and so there's a number of things that come along with that. So you can, you know, a couple of different ways to build relationships into your meeting are using a personal and professional check-in at the beginning of the meeting. That could look very different depending on the meeting again that you might want to do. So you can also, as a facilitator, model the kind of check-in that you want to see. So the length, the type, of responses, and it may be professional, or it may be focused more on personal. So how's working from home going for you is one question that you might want to bring in. Catch us up on one of your other projects. How's your family doing? You know, those might be things that might be more work focused. You can use icebreakers, and the questions, you know, you can think about if there's a purpose, you can kind of keep those short. So should have a purpose, keep it short. You can also do icebreakers in small groups or in pairs. Could be a poll. You could do a visual icebreaker, so you could share a picture of that represents something about this situation, or that means something to you, or you know, something that you want to share with the group. You can also start a sentence and have folks finish the prompt in the chat box. So you know, it could be related to the pandemic, to the meeting, to whatever you'd like. So you could kind of give a visual or an audio cue, chat in the box, and then have everyone kind of chat their responses in at the same time. So the kind of icebreaker that's appropriate, or the kind of personal professional, will depend a lot in the setting that you're in. And one thing that you know is important is include the option to pass. So stress levels are high. Depending on where anyone is at any particular time, they may or may not want to participate. And so always kind of offering that option, you know, to not participate if someone really isn't in that place. And I think right now, you know, there's a lot of challenges, and that may be more likely. So connecting individually is a challenge in virtual settings versus in-person meetings. In an in-person meeting, you have sort of the water cooler chat, you've got the coffee, you can sort of talk with someone at a break. So you can think about how do you integrate that into a virtual setting. And you can include prompts for one-to-one personal chat. So you might say, okay, if you're in a meeting and you're building relationships, okay, personal chat to someone, your response to this question. So you might want to encourage that. You can use breakout room discussions to have people meet in smaller groups. So those can be some ways to create that individual connection, and you can also do that in between meetings in different ways. And so during the meetings themselves, so let people know that you see them. So focusing on, you know, screens make people feel farther away. Using names throughout the meeting is helpful. If someone makes a strong facial expression, or they change something, you know, acknowledging that you see that. If somebody's nodding emphatically, which happens on virtual meetings, you know, note that. So bring that body language into the room, bring folks into the room. People feel seen when they, we're more likely to engage when they feel seen. So you can also, you know, as a facilitator, reflect back what you're seeing, acknowledge people's participations. You can encourage the use of emojis and feedback mechanisms. A lot of virtual platforms have that, you know, thumbs up or red X, or however, you know, you might have the option to do. And if you can't, you know, you can think about scheduling time specifically for team building. So Stephanie talked about these different focuses of meetings. And so if you feel that, you know, you're not getting sufficient time in your regular meetings yourself, you can start thinking about, well, what kind of structure would I want to create for team building? Okay, and the next principle that we'll go to is encouraging responsibility and accountability throughout. So one thing that can happen in a virtual setting, and it can also happen in an in-person setting, is allowing participants to identify, you know, whether consciously or unconsciously as an observer. So doing what you can, if this is a meeting that focuses on active participation, then creating an experience of shared responsibility. So a number of different ways you can do this. So one is expectations in advance. So setting expectations of how you'd like the meeting to be treated. You know, treat it like an in-person meeting. You know, please have your, you know, these things set up for the meeting, or have read these things. You can also give people different roles on the agenda, different tasks of the meeting itself. Might be to discuss an issue that's important to them, to give feedback at a specific point. You can use breakout rooms again as a way to encourage responsibility. So having a small group, if a group gets too large, you can have folks step out. So 2 to 3 max, maybe a little larger than that, depending on what you're doing. If you have have discussions with limited time and a structured task, and then share outs to the larger groups, so you can really have the time for people to engage, who may be more comfortable engaging in smaller groups and also kind of get that collective brainstorming or work to come to the group as a whole. So video can create accountability because you can see them, but as we've talked about, there are a number of things to consider. People may be unable to find a quiet space in their in their home, or they might be juggling lots of things at that particular moment. But video can also create accountability because you can see folks and you can see them and their engagement level a little more. Giving participants autonomy where possible. So allowing them control of choices, like if you'd like to respond verbally or in the chat. Maybe you have a number of different prompts that you might use in a breakout room, and they can select between them. Some platforms allow people to do things like select a personal background or change their names, so bringing in that level of autonomy. And if you're skill building, you can think about, or using a new platform, you can think about starting with the easier tools and building up confidence over time. So, checking for understanding and then building on the concept that you use. So actively encouraging feedback. You can ask for simultaneously responses via chat. You can read out the chat comments. And then you can also think a lot about collaborative problem solving tools. So capturing information on the screen, using the whiteboards that are in many of the virtual platforms, encouraging folks to type their own responses in some kind of a shared document, so Google Docs or Dropbox Live Edit. So any of those kind of collaborative document tools. Okay, thanks, Stephanie. All right, so the fourth principle is managing participant levels. So as we've talked about, virtual meetings can be draining in a different way. Because there's a lot of reasons for that. One is, many of you have alluded to already, the challenges with nonverbal communication. And so we're really focusing harder than in an in-person meeting, and we're seeing people's facial expressions, but we're not getting a full package. And so there's a way that focus can be really draining. There's also the aspect of a screen versus an in-person setting. So you have a number of different things that are bringing in more energy required to process with each other. So, thinking about how do you manage those levels. So session length is one aspect. So less than 2 hours is ideal. If you're going to go longer than that, and any length that you have, just need to be thinking strategically about how you're going to be transitioning between formats. How are you going to engage folks throughout, engaging frequently and in different ways throughout. So, thinking about planning more breaks virtually than you would in person. For physical needs, mini breaks to look away from the screen, so just reducing the impact of staring at the screens. You can think about fun options. So it could be a beauty break, maybe people come back and they share something beautiful with everyone. A nature break, okay, you actually have the task to go out into nature and come back. You can use music as part of this, engage people's bodies within it. So you can use movement breaks, stretching. You can do physical polling, and a lot of the video, if you're using video, you can use have people raise their hand. So think about time zones. If you're scheduling across time zones, rotate who's inconvenient. So you're not always putting one time zone at the early morning or the late day. And just think about, are you meeting at a time where the energy level will match the task? And in a meeting itself, you can always task people to do research or kind of bring in that tendency to multitask and use it in the service of the larger group. And in a virtual setting and in in-person settings, ending early is okay. Usually people don't appreciate going late, but they never seem to mind ending early. So thinking about that in terms of the energy levels. So speaking of energy levels, we want to transition into a movement break, and it's not a running away from the webinar break, because we still have more, but we do want you to take the next 30 seconds to just, stretch. Maybe you want to stand up, get out of your chair, move in whatever way is helpful. Just take a second to look away from the screen, and we'll come back. We've got that blue bar as our timer. And once that reaches the end, we'll go ahead and stop. But just take a few minutes to do whatever feels good to your body to move, and just take a little break. Okay, so we reached the end there. So we'll go ahead and transition to our fifth principle, which is about, and good, someone says they needed that stretch. Thanks, I did too, Ginny. So our fifth principle is about stimulating conversation. You know, we heard from many of you, you're interested in what does it look like to have meaningful discussion in these settings. And one, focus on that is preventing prolonged information sharing. So, presentations done virtually can reduce the energy and focus. So, Stephanie mentioned a number of things related to this. So thinking about, do you need to have a meeting for what the topic of it is? Only information sharing? Is this something that can be done by recording? Can you send it in advance? Can you use an advance materials to then spend time on the live engagement, maybe discussing that or taking it to the next step? A good rule of thumb, to work with attention spans, which we've talked about a few times, are short and maybe shortening in this whole situation, is structuring content delivery in 20-minute segments. So every 20 minutes there should be a shift or a transition of some kind. So it might be that you start with content delivery, then you may turn to an exercise, then you may have a discussion. So doing those, transitioning the type of activity that you're working with can do a lot with working with energy levels and attention span. Send preparatory material before and use the time, for discussion in the course. Think about what's the number of slides that are absolutely necessary to convey information. So less is more, minimum amount of material. So don't go long without meaningful engagement or with problem solving in some way. And just some different techniques that you might use. So you could use, a fishbowl technique, which I know many of us have seen in person. You could do that virtually, where you have a small group discussing and others can add in questions or comments via the chat. So that could be one tool to use. You can also increase interaction through the chat box. We've talked about the breakout rooms or small group discussions, polling, or these online collaboration tools. And then some of you had questions about, accessibility considerations. And so we won't, we'll kind of just give a little overview about some things to think about with virtual settings, and it is different in a virtual setting. So, the ability, you notice when we send out our prep materials, we asked if you have accessibility needs or concerns, please let us know. So asking in advance, knowing your audience is good practice. So do you need to provide things like closed captioning? Thinking about things like keyboard shortcuts or automatic transcripts, and those may be built into different programs, or you may need to think about which programs have access to those things. Screen readers, is the screen reader compatible? Do you need simultaneous translation? Do you need ASL interpreters? And then depending on what you know about, who's in your audience, do you announcing a name before speaking? So that can be helpful for folks. Reading aloud the chat, what's in the chat, and bringing that into the meeting verbally. So, providing materials ahead of time if you can, and if needed, you can describe any visuals that aren't provided ahead of time, any processes that are occurring, and just also thinking about throughout, who has what technology and who has what resources. There are different amounts of internet access and coverage, and how that plays into accessibility, different equipment availability, and having these kind of tiered levels of engagement. It might be built for a full computer, but not everyone may have that set up. And so thinking about how do you bring in the phone only folks, or have a different kind of participation ways, or is there something that's could happen before or after. So thinking through those accessibility considerations, and the details are going to depend a lot on the needs that you have for the meeting and the type of meeting that you have, and sort of what platforms you're using. But it's a really critical, important thing to think about. That's different, has different details in a virtual setting than some that, and some overlap with what you'd have in an in-person setting. Okay, and our next principle is facilitating discussion and interaction. So, and as in every meeting, some people are more likely to talk than others. This can be impacted by meeting size too. So just a few considerations around this. So one is explicitly having a facilitator, so having someone in that role, who their role is to encourage and facilitate discussion. Work to get new voices in the room. You know, I saw on, there was a note in the chat box, or maybe it was in the question about how do you hear from quieter voices, and just a few considerations that will tie into here, but having a way to manage the discussion. So using the raised hand feature or setting expectations for how you want to bring people verbally into the conversation so that people know, you know, how to get in the queue and how to participate. Explicitly ask to hear from those you haven't heard from. So if you notice you've got a lot of same voices that you're hearing from, make space for those who haven't. Don't, you know, asking explicitly for different perspectives. So you might notice the conversation's going one direction. Sounds like there's a lot of energy here. Is there anyone who has a different perspective about this? Is there anything else that anyone's thinking, any reactions anyone's having to what's being in? So explicitly kind of make space for those different perspectives. Not assuming, don't assume silence means agreement. Silence can mean a lot of different things. On an in-person meeting, in a virtual meeting. So really kind of checking, using those check-ins and working with the silence, but not assuming it means that there is agreement. You could use a go-around structure. Many of us have participated in this in an in-person meeting. So set structure, set time to hear from everyone. That can bring out different voices. I would suggest also having an option to pass if you're going to do that. One thing that a virtual setting can be helpful is there is the chat function often, and some people feel comfortable participating in chat when they might never verbally in a room. So encouraging these different ways of participating, you know, using the polls, the real-time feedback. You could think about anonymous sharing or anonymous questions submitted in advance. So sometimes people who might not feel comfortable in sharing in a meeting might do that. Have time for individual work, for small group work. You could give folks targeted questions, provide materials in advance, utilize these different platforms for collaboration. You know, maybe people might engage in those in different ways. If you have phone-only participants, so check in with them directly to see if they want to share. Read aloud the chat. Just keep in mind, you know, what they're not being able to see, and how that plays into things. So explicitly guiding the conversation as the facilitator and asking throughout, you know, what's not clear, taking time to summarize what you see, and really bring in those discussions and those perspectives. And let's see. So we've got a couple of those tools here. So round robins, using these different engagement methods throughout, and then anonymous feedback are some things you can think about. Okay, so the next principle is utilizing the time efficiently and then utilizing the time in between meetings well. So, you know, pushing some activities to before or after the meeting. So we've talked about this a bit, but only, you know, think about, is this meeting necessary? And only have meetings when necessary. Many of us are having many meetings right now. And we're in this position where we're using the same tools both professionally and personally. And so if there's not a meeting needed, you can reduce that overall burden. So you can use, you know, survey tools, collecting questions in advance, using polls or Google Docs to work on things in between meetings. Some of the same tools, targeted questions to bring into the next discussion, or bringing individual work into the meeting sessions, sending materials in advance. You can utilize asynchronous platforms for in-between meeting work. You know, we use MS Teams internally, so that's what we're using. And so we might share and work on documents, be chatting about projects. You know, start your sessions on time. You know, suggest not using sessions to recap what was shared in advance if you are sharing materials, and really use that time to get into things, except, you know, potentially sharing at a high level. You can also think about how you know, using deadlines can be helpful to increase accountability. So thinking about, you know, what really has to be done in the meeting itself, how can I best structure the meeting to do that task, and how do I also use these other tools before, after, and in between meetings. Okay, and then the eighth and the last principle is actively debriefing and evaluating the meeting. So after typical in-person meetings, you know, there's these informal opportunities to debrief and de-stress. So you can build that into the meetings that you're having. So maybe you build in the debrief for 10 minutes just to debrief at the end. thinking about, you know, the effectiveness of your meeting, getting feedback, tweaking meetings and your practices based on what you learn. You might do that in a poll, in a survey, in person, could be any, or sorry, virtually, could be any different way. You could also have, you know, a water cooler discussion thread in your asynchronous platform. So just a space for those things to happen that might kind of normally be debriefed in person, but thinking about where those things may occur now in an all virtual setting. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our principles, and we want to take a few minutes to hear from you. So we're curious, what approaches or tools have worked well in virtual meetings that you're facilitating or that you've been part of, so that we can all we can learn from what we've all experienced during this time, and also what we've been doing as facilitators. So take the next 20 seconds and we'll just do a self-reflection. We've got a blue bar that you'll see we'll reach the end. And after that, what we'd like to do is ask for you to share in 2 ways. So feel free to type your response into the chat. And then if you'd like to share verbally, we want to invite some folks in to come in over audio at this time as well. And so if you'd like to come in verbally, just raise your hand and we'll bring you into the discussion. And then we'll be capturing some of your ideas on screen.
While you are self-reflecting, I did want to bring in a couple of great chat questions. We have a repeated question of how many folks do we have actually running today's webinar? 3 to 4. Brian stayed on just to kind of hear what was going on, and he's answering a couple questions in chat, but dominantly we have 3 staff members devoted to this, both Melanie and I as co-presenters, and we have Ben, who's on our team behind the scenes as our wizard tech, answering questions and dealing with any technical issues that happen. And there's a host of reasons why we do that. And one predominantly is dealing with technical difficulties. Ben was actually supposed to be sharing, but he's dealing with internet issues. So I am now sharing, which is why you might see some slides jumping kind of quickly as Melanie and I try to coordinate that. So that's usually have at least 2 people. It's best if you can have 3. Melanie and I are taking turns, just so you know, answering chat and monitoring the chat and answering questions while one of us is presenting, and that's to ensure that we can really listen to what we're hearing or reading what we're hearing, and being responsive to folks as those questions and comments come in. So Melanie, I know you're checking. We have 1 raised hand from Jason Villancourt.
Perfect. Yeah, let's go there first. So Jason, we're gonna unmute you and we're gonna bring you into the room here.
All right, you are open, mic, Jason.
And Jason, if you're talking, you may be on mute on your end. Let's see.
All right, Jason, we might come back to you.
Yeah, we'll try to come back to you.
Chat us when you're ready. And I saw Dana Roth. I think your hand was up, but then it went down. So we're going to go to Michael Nelson. Michael, we're going to open up your mic. Make sure you unmute yourself. So we are dealing with some technical difficulties of opening up mics. Jason, is your mic open? Are you ready to talk?
It shows it's open. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Yes. You sound great.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm the public affairs guy here, so I thought I'd be the guinea pig. So we've been using a little bit of, I'm with ERM Public Affairs. We work with a number of different clients and do facilitation, as well as work with clients generally on stakeholder engagement and strategic communications. So Mentimeter is a really cool tool. It kind of hit me when you talked a little bit about facilitating discussion and interaction. I jotted down Mentimeter. It actually sort of hit in your encourage responsibility and accountability part too, because it's a fun way to engage folks. You can do polling, you can do word clouds. So if you're asking for what do people think about what we've done so far, give us your ideas. And people are throwing, productive information, confusing. So you're getting a sense from folks on the call what they're feeling from what your presentation has been thus far, or challenges. So you can make polls, you can do word clouds, you can do lots of really cool things. People do it through their phone. So it causes them to pick up their phone, type in menti.com, and you put in a code, and then you're live in the poll. So it really engages the audience a little bit more. It causes them to do different things and to think differently, and it's been productive for us.
That's great. And I didn't mean to cut you off there. I did want to point out we do have a couple other panelists that seem to be interested in opening up too. Jason, was there anything else you wanted to add before we open up for the next mic?
No, all good. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. All right, Michael, we have your mic opened. If you can open it up. If not, no worries. You can also, you're encouraged to send in a chat box. And I think those are the last of our raised hands. You're ready if you want to unmute on your end, Jason, or Michael, sorry. All right. So Michael might be coming in. While he's doing that, I did want to touch on a couple of questions and answers that we got, or questions. We dealt with a couple of them already. I had one that was really good, both in chat and the question and answer, and that's snarky chatters, on whether or not you read aloud all of the messages you get in the chat. This is where we use some of those facilitation skills, where if it's an important, meaningful contribution to the discussion, maybe paraphrasing to remove the snark, or just checking in with folks and seeing, did you mean this in a rephrasing way that maybe is more palatable for the larger audience. But it is a really good question. You want to acknowledge folks that are upset and be able to be responsive. And an interesting factor is whether or not they sent the snarky text via all, so you have options to send it just to the presenters or to the full group. Some folks don't necessarily get that little arrow and how to do that, but that might be a factor on whether or not they wanted to present it. And if they did it to everybody, they might have actually gotten what they needed to in acknowledging it, and you can just focus on the perspective and the content that's relevant to the discussion, and maybe not the frustration that they might be feeling. In terms of another really great question we had dealt with combining folks together in chat or developing breakouts. I think it was more of a comment and a suggestion. And that is another really great tool. If you have that functionality in your meeting, it would be a little bit more difficult in something like this, where you have over 200 participants, to separate folks in individually, but you could do something with taking a poll and offering opportunities to go into different breakouts. If you're offering breakouts, you could also encourage folks to do private chats, as I think Melanie discussed as well. So there's different ways to pair folks up and quickly divide them that way. And part of that, and this also gets to another couple questions, they're related. So one is folks aren't used to using these internet functions, and that's an important thing to recognize, and offering tools visually and also on the phone of how to use those tools. You'll notice we incorporated that quite a bit in the webinar, as this is how you do that and this is the next step. The other component is, those are for the folks that are willing to learn but just don't know. And so offer those resources. You're going to have folks that just do not want to participate in these types of online engagement tools. And that's part of your original assessment of, do I do a virtual meeting? If you have a number of folks who just do not like the technology, they're not interested in learning the technology, and you're having trouble engaging with them that way, that's where you kind of think through, maybe a virtual meeting isn't going to work for these folks, and maybe we have to figure out alternatives, whether that be documents in advance, phone calls, doing a teleconference, sharing materials in advance, or getting questions in advance that you can respond to, both in a webinar platform to kind of share those perspectives for folks who are willing to participate virtually, as well as to respond to them via email or paper, or whatever method works better for those folks that just are having difficulty with the new technology. All right, I think I want to be cognizant of time, and we're getting a lot of really great comments both in the share. Michael, I wanted to just check in with you. I apologize, it looks like we're having difficulty on your end, but if there's anyone else, we can answer those questions via the question and answer box in the chat, as Melanie's going to take over monitoring that. So I do want to get into a quick wrap up of some of the discussions we had. A few questions that came up in addition is roles of participants. Breakout rooms are a really great way to help folks identify their roles. We answered this in the question and answer, but for those of you that weren't tracking that, sometimes you have different roles. And you may have an advisory group as panelists and then have observers as participants. So that's one way you might use the virtual platform, but really think through whether that's going to be valuable. It's also going to be dependent on participant responsibility and whether or not those folks are really going to be able to follow the rules of engagement that you've set out for your presentation. So you really don't want to have a situation where you open up the floor to panelists and have them not participate in the way that you've dictated. You know, you don't want them taking over more time, maybe sharing inappropriate things. So it really depends on how much you know the participants and being aware of your audience, which is all part of that pre-planning we talked about for a virtual platform. So there's ways to do that. It's just you have to be cognizant of it. And then back to some of the discussions that Melanie shared. Options for virtual engagement, we have a few. They're not as open as in person, but they are great. You know, you have video, which is fantastic. It offers a closer approximation, but there's pros and cons, as we discussed. You know, you get some of the visual and social cues, but not all of them. And people aren't as honest in their visual cues on a video than they might be if they're in a meeting, right? Because not only are they showing you a presentation that they want you to see, they're also kind of able to see what their social cues are. And some folks, there's studies that show they look more towards themselves than others. You'll notice I'm trying to look at my camera, but sometimes we don't look at the camera because we're looking at our notes, we're looking at other people, and so the visual cues aren't quite the same, so that's a con, but it is a little bit better. You can do raise hand, you can see if people are excited, you can emote a lot better, both personally and seeing from your participants. So there's definitely some pros and cons of using video, but you really have to think through what those look like. And thinking through whether it's going to be the best situation, particularly given that we are dealing with overload and it's a lot to be on a screen all day. It's exhausting. I will also point out for folks that were saying, you know, we'd really like folks to share their videos so we can see them. It makes our job easier. Totally get that, but also being cognizant of some of the other points we've heard is disruptions. People may be shutting off their video because they have children or the possibility of disruptions, and they might not even be participating in audio because they've got a loud dog or they're dealing with situations in telework. There's a reason I have this background, and it's really to be dealing with that. So those are some of the things to think through about video and whether or not folks are engaging with video and why, and what alternatives you might be able to use. We have used chat quite a bit today, and so that's really a function that we're aware of. And it's a pretty common tool in most of the platforms. And I noticed in the chat box we have some folks that are sharing different platforms they're using and the tools. And it's really going to vary, but chat and video are usually some of the solid options. We've had discussions on whether or not chat is too much of a distraction. There's some recommendations of allowing folks to do private chat and some of the values of doing that and using it as a way to bring people into the conversation. There are ways as the host to disable those chat participants who might be not following the rules. And so you can use that. It's not ideal, but sometimes it's required. You might have to just take someone off the chat box, and you might be in a situation where you just need to completely disable the chat box for everybody because someone broke the rules. I've been in meetings like that. But generally, chat is a really great function. If you build in cues, questions, and opportunities to engage, it can be a way to help folks multitask and still engage in the discussion of the meeting. And then obviously audio is something that everybody is really familiar with and they use very often. And it's a great way to keep talking to folks, and it's something we're used to, right? We've had telephones for quite a long time, and it's something we can maintain and utilize. And sometimes don't underestimate the value of just picking up a one-on-one phone call these days and reaching out to a person individually, particularly if you have that flexibility with a smaller group. Or maybe some of those folks that just aren't into the tech, they'll be more willing to just pick up a phone call and talk to you. So polls, Q&A, these are some of the tools that you've seen us do. There's also opportunities for reactions and options there. One person mentioned building in a breakout for coffee. That could be something that you could use to create an informal session. I would harken back to the manage energy tip, which is if your informal and connectivity and break is associated with looking at the screen, you're going to be exhausting people's eyes and their ability to participate that way. So be really cognizant of how you might use coffee breakouts or other tools, and thinking through the length of your meeting. Most important though, acknowledge what you see and hear and learn from your participants. Even if you don't agree with folks, if you are hearing what they're saying and really taking an effort to acknowledge it, hear it, and maybe try to understand it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree. That can go a really long way, particularly when you're dealing with conflicts, and particularly when you might be dealing with situations where there's some tension with the topic you're discussing, not just the tensions that we're all living with today. So just a quick reminder to follow the basics. Focus on what is important. What's the purpose of the meeting? What value and good will this meeting provide to your project, the world, your participants? Offer opportunities to co-create, lots of opportunities. Really think through different ways that folks can co-create, whether that's screen sharing that we showed, whether it's providing input in chat boxes, putting people into breakouts, maybe even developing materials in advance to share in a webinar platform and have folks do some work offline that they can share with the larger group. Being really clear on roles, both in terms of your participants and your panelists and your hosts, who's responsible for what. You don't see the behind the scenes, but we know that, Melanie right now is monitoring my chat. I've got other folks monitoring Q&A, being really clear on that, and also being clear with participants how you anticipate they will engage and how you'd like them to engage. Comfort and inclusivity, create as most comfortable environment as you can. This is not comfortable for most folks. This is not the traditional way that we engage. It's really hard to create relationships this way, so you really have to think through and be creative on that. And you have to give alternatives and recognize that not everybody is going to be comfortable using the tools that you have. And it's not something against you. It's not something that you can necessarily address, but offering options. It's the same way that we would do Post-its or comment box in person, just thinking through what tools we can do here. And also being really clear on expectations. What can you do and what can't you do in a virtual platform, both in setting expectations for yourself. Remember that unicorn? Set expectations for yourself that are reasonable as well as your participants. And then always just prepare and adapt and realize that no matter what you do, you're going to have technical difficulties and you're going to have to adapt. And here's just some of the technical difficulties. I could share so many stories of things that we've dealt with and we've had to adjust, including having my internet just drop right before a meeting. You just have to have a low-tech or alternative backup plan because you will likely need to adapt where you can. And then most important is know your equipment and the platforms and what they can do and can't do. Make sure your presenters and your technical wizards know what they can work on. And we are running short on time and I don't want to be too late. So we had a quick poll. I'm gonna do this really quickly. Feel free to do it, scroll down. We're just curious of what you really enjoyed and would like to hear from you as we leave off. And so I've got that poll going, and I just want you to be aware of some upcoming trainings we have in person. I won't go into detail of these. We'll be sharing those after the fact in an email. Likewise, you can share any questions on training at Udall. I apologize, we had some questions that were not answered, but we will respond to those as we can, including how to adapt meetings to an online platform. But feel free via email or the chat box to let us know how this was. We really value your input. We'd like to hear from you. What was the most effective part? What might you change? Is there anything else relating to virtual facilitation we could share? And it looks like we've got about half of you responding to our poll, and I'm just going to share those results for you all. And just checking. Oh, it looks like at least 4 of you were sleeping. So we apologize for that, but hopefully most of you, it looks like, enjoyed quite a bit of some of what we provided. We will be sharing slides and we will be following up. I want to open it up if Melanie wants to say any final words, because I don't want to keep you over 12, and I know we ran a little over just with some of the great discussions and chat we got. Melanie, did you want to add anything to folks before we head out?
No, nothing else from me. Just thanks all for participating and for adding in all of your thoughts about engaging meetings. And hopefully this webinar has been helpful to you, and we look forward to talking with you more. Feel free to reach out to us, as Stephanie mentioned.
Yes, our emails and contact will be shared, as well as the slides. Here it is. Feel free to email us or call us with any additional questions you have that we couldn't cover today. So everybody have a wonderful day. Enjoy virtual where you can. Enjoy personal interactions where you can. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for joining us today. Take care.